Have you ever thought about the fact that patterns on windows can be dangerous? Even deadly dangerous? I don't think so. I never suspected it either until that ill-fated day. But let's start from the beginning. My name is Dennis. I am a very ordinary student of the most traditional university in the capital of Siberia. I entered here 5 years ago and am already in my last year. I live in society, since my parents are not rich, and there is no extra money in the family. Therefore, when I was offered a part-time job at a weather station near Novosibirsk, I did not refuse. The money was not much, but the work was not dusty either. They explained everything to me on my first shift. It is necessary to sit at the station at night and watch a whole wall of good switches and light bulbs, and in case of unforeseen circumstances, make notes about the incident in the journal and report to the higher personnel by phone. I quickly got used to some of the circumstances and responsibilities, as well as some remaining money, which I could use to go to the cinema and a cafe with a girl, and sometimes even get pizza delivered to the dorm. Shifts were exclusively night shifts, so as not to interfere with my studies. And so, one of the last evenings I arrived at work, my replacement, Alexei, was already getting ready to go home and was warming up the engine of his car. "Hi, Dennis," he said, smiled and offered me his hand. "You are in no hurry to get to work today?" "Missed my bus," I answered a little guiltily. Alexei was already a little over 30 years old, and he was never late. If he had a day shift, and he took over my post in the morning. "We have a small problem today. The electric heating is acting up. If you turn on a higher position, the machines turn off. It's -20 outside today and windy. It's chilly to sit with the heating at half power. This sucks. And what should I do? I'll freeze here until the morning." The repair crew was supposed to arrive an hour ago. They were probably delayed at another site, but they'll definitely arrive today. "Without an electric boiler, we'll have to light fires here all night long." Alexei joked and wrapped a scarf around his neck, write down the time of the crew's arrival and departure in the log. "I don't remember the number. Something about repair work. I'll find it. That's it. I'm going home. Have a good shift." With the essence of the word, he put his hat on his head and moved towards the exit. I started changing and getting ready for my shift. After the frosty street, it seemed very warm here, but I knew that the coldness does not immediately take away the heat from the body. At first, it always seems that the room is quite nice, but give yourself a couple of hours and your fingers will freeze, and working with such fingers will not be particularly pleasant. While I was thinking about how I would keep the entire night shift warm if the repairmen didn't arrive, the door opened and showed Alexei's head, generously covered in snow. "We've arrived. Open the gate for them," he said, and his head left the room. The door closed. A view of nature at some distance from the city, and to get here, I had to drive to the final stop on the route and stop another 10 minutes walk along the road cut through Sosnovy Borough. The station itself was located on a huge edge of the forest. The entire territory, which occupied about half a hectare of space, was moved with a chain-link fence to a height of a couple of meters. There were only 2 entrances to the territory, one next to the main gate and one rough one on the back of the grate. Having quickly thrown on my jacket, I ran out into the street and headed for the gate. The weather had deteriorated significantly. The wind was howling loudly in the wires. Snow was flying parallel to the ground. In such frost and with the wind, all the warmth was instantly knocked out of me. I wanted to get back inside as soon as possible. A Niva of the repair team with orange stripes on the sides was parked at the gate. I moved the stop and opened them. The car drove into the territory and drove to the improvised parking lot. 2 people got out of it. One was tall and thin, the second was a head shorter and stocky. Alexei turned off his car, went up to the team, shook everyone's hand and said, "Since I'm still here, let's go show the work front." I adhere to lightning. I don't like to communicate with people. For me, another obvious advantage of this job was that you need to communicate with real people minimally. Anatoly and Vadim, that was the name of the repair service employees, took off their outerwear and left it on a hanger at the entrance to the building. Alexei led them into the inner room, which was used to store all the equipment at the station, and showed them the necessary panel. The tour repairman's name was Anatoly, and he began inspecting the heating system. After rummaging around inside, he tried to turn on the heating at the 3rd position, but the fuses immediately blew out, and he was plunged into darkness. "I see you have several heating elements here. After the 2nd position, additional ones are connected and they break down. I'll go and make sure you have spare ones," he said, and restored the power supply to the station. Alexei said goodbye to everyone, wished me a successful shift once again, and he and Anatoly headed for the exit. Vadim and I were left alone, and I offered him some tea. He agreed, and while I was filling the kettle with water, the door opened and Alexei walked in with a puzzled look. "I'll have to spend the night here now, it seems," he said somewhere into the air. It turned out that while he was showing everything to the team, the weather had gotten much worse. Visibility had become almost zero, and the car was covered in a thick layer of snow. I looked at the thermometer readings and was slightly taken aback. The dashboard showed -43 degrees Celsius, but when I arrived here it was 20 degrees at most. A couple of minutes later, Anatoly came in, saying that he had found the necessary spare part for the repair. The wind whistled and howled outside. I went to the window and saw almost nothing, The snow was falling in a practically uniform white sheet. Only occasionally small gaps were visible, and only by them could one guess that this whole cloudy white mass was moving. In addition, frost patterns began to appear on the windows. They were drawn right in front of me on the window glass, acquiring bizarre shapes. Is our thermometer It's already showing -49, said Alexei, tearing my gaze away from the patterns. Look at the windows, I responded. They're freezing right before our eyes. In my opinion, the thermometer is not lying. I turned to the window again and almost jumped in surprise. At first I thought that someone was looking from the street into the station window, but it turned out that one of the patterns formed a terrible face with its outlines. The mouth was wide open, and the face as a whole resembled a grimace of suffering. It's snowing hard there, of course. The gates are already covered in snowdrifts. Our Neva's one big snowdrift. We'll have to dig it out. I think that road along the pine forest is also covered in snow. So Vadim, we're stuck here. Anatoly's voice sounded. The repairmen started discussing something, and I had already disconnected from their conversation and returned to this face on the glass. Come here, I shouted to Alexei and waved my hand in my direction. Look at this crap. Indeed crap, he said thoughtfully, examining the window. Could a random pattern have come together like that? Mysticism, by God. I reached another window. There was something similar there. Not the same face, but clearly a face. This is definitely not a coincidence. No one would joke in such weather on the outskirts of the city, and two faces woven from ice patterns by chance were definitely not a coincidence. Same here, I shouted. A wave of fear rolled through me. The expression on those faces made me feel uneasy, and there was no hope for anything good from them. Everyone turned around at my shout. Anatoly came up to me, saw that face, and couldn't think of anything better than to put his finger to the place where the pattern had a mouth. As soon as his finger touched the glass, Anatoly froze. A layer of ice appeared between his finger and the glass. Anatoly didn't move. What's wrong with you? Vadim shouted at him and tried to tear his partner's hand away from the glass. His hand wouldn't budge, as if his finger was frozen solid into the glass. Patterns like on a window started to creep from his finger towards his shoulder. The skin turned blue as the pattern moved, and Anatoly himself didn't even breathe. I tried to pull him away from the window, but his body was so cold even through his clothes that I almost burned my hands with the cold. Tolia, wake up. His partner raised his voice and tried to pull him away from the window. Nothing worked. The pattern had already reached his shoulders and was stretching towards Anatoly's face and legs. We watched silently, fell into a state of stupor, and watched as this pattern spread. When it reached his mouth, it itself began to open, and the expression became similar to the icy faces on the windows. The glass itself was covered with a thick layer of ice, but these terrifying faces were clearly visible. It seemed to me that empty eyes without pupils were watching me from the surface of the windows. You know this effect with some portraits. Wherever you go, the gaze is always on you. Everyone stood in bewilderment. Something inexplicable was happening right before our eyes. The repairman was covered in a crust of ice with these terrible patterns. Alexei looked at the information display and said almost in a whisper, -66, holy shit. We're going to freeze to death here, if this thing doesn't get to us sooner. I replied, clearly panicking. We need to notify the city. With these words, Alexei took out his phone, looked at the display and started spinning around and raising the device above his head, obviously trying to catch a signal. There's no connection. Does anyone have a network? Vadim and I looked at the screens of our smartphones without much hope. There was no network at all. The pattern from the glass moved to the windowsill, to the slopes of the window opening, and had already begun to move along the wall. I looked at Anatoly. He was completely covered in ice, and now you couldn't even tell a person was inside this ice block. The pattern was crawling along the floor from him in all directions. At some point I noticed that one of those faces was starting to form on the floor. The display showed that the temperature outside had dropped to 73 degrees. We were all silent for a while. Alexei was the first to speak. Okay, let's think about what we can do. We're at the station, in the middle of a pine forest. The temperature outside is below 70 degrees, and there's a blizzard. Going out would be pure suicide. The cars won't start, and even if they did, you can't drive through these snowdrifts. There's no connection. We don't know what kind of natural phenomenon this is or what area it's covering. And on top of that, some kind of devilry is going on. These demons on the windows. We can't touch them, if we don't want to end up like him. With these words, he shook his head towards the ice idol, which 10 minutes ago was more than a living person. All we can do is wait it out here. Maybe this frost front will pass, and we'll be able to get out. Oh, we should have gone home straight away. You might not have made it. We don't even know if all this is happening locally or if these patterns have already killed half the city. I answered him. Alexei immediately got worked up, obviously thinking about his family. We still have electricity. We can try to restore the boiler to full capacity and then we'll be able to hold out. Vadim, who had been silent until then, responded. After that, he glanced at his former colleague and sighed. The temperature was still gradually falling. I wonder how low it could go. There was no time to waste, so we all went to the engineering room. It was the best place on the station, because it was enclosed by walls inside the walls of the building itself. In addition, there were no windows, and they were definitely worth avoiding right now. Vadim unscrewed the screws and, with some difficulty, removed the boiler cover. Here's the burnt-out heating element. You can tell by the color. We'll quickly replace it and it should work, but we'll have to turn off the electricity temporarily. Here's a flashlight. Shine it on me, Vadim said and pulled the machine gun down. The building immediately plunged into darkness and silence. If before this the lighting devices and the heating boiler were buzzing, now there was complete silence at the station and the howling of the wind outside was clearly audible. Alexei took the flashlight, and I decided to go on reconnaissance. Turning on the lighting on my phone, I moved very carefully shining the light up to my legs. I did not want to step into these patterns. The wall with the windows was completely frozen. It was all covered in patterns and nightmarish faces could be guessed here and there. The frozen repairman was in place. From him, the patterns had already crawled almost to the middle of the room. A multicolored glow swayed outside the windows. It looked like the northern lights. What was going on there? I had no answers. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed outerwear on a hanger by the door. Unfortunately, the clothes were covered in patterns, and I did not even risk approaching them. Luckily for me, the couch for the staff was by the wall farthest from the windows, with several blankets and pillows on it. I grabbed everything and returned to the engineering room. Vadim had just finished installing the repair heating element and clicked the machine. Lighting and the familiar buzzing filled the building, and it became even easier. We tried turning the boiler handle to the third position and everything went well. The fourth and fifth positions also worked. Having decided to sit it out in this little room, we closed the door and began to wait. The room had clearly become warmer. We spread out the blankets and settled down on them. It was quite comfortable. The only inconvenience was the poor lighting inside. It was dim. The patterns had already frozen the main room and were almost there. There was nothing left to do but close the door and wait for the morning. And with it, help, if there were any living people left in this world. We started talking, and I learned a little more about Vadim. He was 56 years old. He had worked at the same electrical substation his entire life, first as an electrician, then as a duty officer. But in the last couple of years, this work began to seem too stressful, and he went to work for a mobile repair team. In terms of peace of mind, it was much easier. That's where he met Anna. Vadim spoke well of him, said that they had become friends in the last year and was very sorry that he was gone, although it is unknown whether we will be able to get out of here alive. While we were talking and trying to somehow encourage each other, I heard footsteps in the hallway. The wind was still howling, so it was unlikely that anyone had reached us. The sound of footsteps approached and stopped at our door. Silence fell. We all strained our ears until our ears were ringing. "Guys, are you here?" A voice came from behind the door. It was Anatoly's voice, but there was clearly something wrong with it. Some vowel sounds seemed to have a sound filter added to them, making them quieter than they should be. "Open up. It's very cold in here." "We are not opening it under any circumstances." "It's not him," Vadim whispered. We sat without making a sound, and the creature behind the door tried to lure us out or force us to open the door for him. The door handle began to twitch a little. I jumped to the door and tried to hold it. The next moment my hand was burned, and I found myself in a different place. It was a cave, shrouded in semi-darkness and ice. The northern lights were breaking through the ice, illuminating the cave. Sharp icicles were sticking out from everywhere and in all directions. I looked around and saw something that I wished I hadn't seen. Standing to the side of me was a creature about 3 meters tall with the same face that appeared in the patterns. It was holding Anatoly's body in one hand and was gnawing off limbs and body parts with a disgusting crunch. The repairman was frozen and only his eyes could move. He looked at me, his gaze filled with horror and a plea for death. There were many frozen bodies scattered around. More precisely, remains of bodies. I felt sick, and nausea began to rise up my esophagus. I could not hold back the urge to vomit and made a noise. The monster turned its head in my direction, threw its body away and walked towards me. I started to back away, slipped and fell, hitting my head painfully. When I opened my eyes, the monster was already reaching for me. I closed my eyes and tried to push its hand away with mine, and then I was thrown out into our world again. My hand was burning unbearably and aching almost to the elbow. "Why the hell did you even bother?" Alexei said. Both he and Vadim were holding me by the shoulders on the floor, and they were looking at the door with wide eyes. The roar of the wind became stronger for a few seconds, leaving an unpleasant ringing in my ears, and began to subside. Footsteps were heard in the corridor again, but this time moving away from us. The wind died down completely. We risked looking out of the engineering room only half an hour later. There was no one. The walls, floor, ceiling, and furniture were covered with patterns, but there was no terrifying face on them. The temperature gauge showed -31 degrees, and the blizzard was almost over. I looked out the window. The cars were completely covered in snow. The phone network came back on, and we were able to contact the duty officer. Soon the road to the station was cleared, and we were able to leave for the city. Then there were proceedings with the management and the police. I remember how the boss called me in and asked me to tell him what happened that night. After all, the man had disappeared. I tried to smooth things over and not talk about supernatural devilry, but he sighed and said that he had seen the footage from the surveillance cameras. He said that the frozen body of that repairman had come out the front door when the blizzard was ending. He said that all this mysticism happened quite locally and nothing like this had been observed in the city. He also advised me to keep my mouth shut, because some structures were interested in this whole story, with whom it is better not to joke. Later, employees of these structures found me and made me sign a non-disclosure agreement. That night I lost 2 fingers on my hand. They were so frozen that they had to be and there was a mark from a frost pattern on the outside of my hand. I quit my job at the station that same day, and I'm still afraid of the patterns on the glass. I even bought a refrigerator without a freezer. I think that that creature can drag people through these patterns, open passages to its dimension to feed. I see that crunch in Anatoly's eyes in my nightmares, and I pray that this creature doesn't find me. After all, this monster managed to get a taste of me.